Autosomal dominant optic atrophy is a so-called rare disease leading to a debilitating and irreversible loss of vision. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of attention from the research community for this disease, but I found one of the few people who do research on ADOA. I'm going to meet with him at Cambridge University. Dr. Patrick Yu-Wai-Man is an academic neuro-ophthalmologist with a major research interest in mitochondrial eye diseases. Hi, Dr. Patrick. It is so nice to meet you finally and to have this conversation. Can you give us a brief description of what ADOA is and what it entails for the patient suffering from it?
Right, first of all, thanks for visiting Cambridge today. So ADOA stands for autosomal dominant optic atrophy. Some people also refer to it as DOA. And it's an umbrella of various conditions. We'll talk a bit more about what optic atrophy means, but essentially it's a genetic condition that affects the optic nerve and causes progressive loss of vision. And I mentioned the fact that this is an umbrella group of disorders because there can be different genetic changes that can cause ADOA, right? So why do you lose vision in this condition, right? The way I tend to look at this in a very simplistic way is Mother Nature has given us two eyes, which are very sophisticated cameras that allow us to convert an image into an electrical signal, and then the signal is sent to the back of the brain where the vision centers are located, and that's where the supercomputer integrates the signal to create the visual perception of that image. It's fine having a camera, it's fine having a computer, but in between you must have a way of channeling the information. And it is the optic nerve which does that. And it's very much like a very super fast broadband cable that connects the eye with the brain. And in this condition, autosomal dominant optic atrophy, it's the optic nerve which gets damaged. And the optic nerve gets damaged because a specialized type of cells within the eye, within the retina, known as the retinal ganglion cells, are preferentially damaged, and this leads to progressive loss of vision. And the reason why it's called optic atrophy is because as the damage progresses, the optic nerve becomes pale, right? And the pallor that you can see at the back of the eye, the technical jargon for that in the medical language is optic atrophy, right? And the reason why it's called autosomal is because that's the mode of inheritance, and we'll talk about that shortly. So in this condition, visual loss starts quite early on. Most people will start experiencing visual loss before the age of 10. What varies and what's quite remarkable is different people will have different degrees of visual loss, and it can proceed at different speed. So you can have a young child where obviously the parents will spot that their child's vision is not good enough because they're sitting very close to the TV, they're keeping things very close to their face, and obviously alarm bells will be ringing, and the parents will bring their children to see a doctor and eventually an ophthalmologist. In other situations, actually, the degree of visual loss is quite mild and it progresses quite slowly, and people might only be aware of the fact that they have this condition when they're in their teenage years, late teenage years, they go for their driving test and they're unable to read the number plate, right? In other extremes, there can be people who are not aware of any visual problems and they're only identified because someone as a family has poor vision, they've gone through the genetic testing and they've been confirmed to carry a specific genetic defect, right? So that's it. There's a broad spectrum, right, from the visually asymptomatic to the severely visually impaired and they've been registered legally blind. And that's one of the things that we need to know more about why there's such a spectrum of clinical presentation.
And what are your estimates on the incidence of the prevalence of ADOA?
This is a very good point, because to be able to get a feel of how many patients there are in a specific country to try and determine the level of service that you need to provide, we did a pretty comprehensive epidemiological study of not only ADOA but other inherited eye diseases. And roughly speaking, in this country, the prevalence of autosomal dominant optic atrophy is about 1 in 25,000. So in this population here, there will be roughly around 3,000 people with a degree of visual impairment from ADOA. So it's not an ultra-rare condition, right? But still it's within the group of rare diseases.
Right. And are these people all registered?
A lot of these patients actually, and I use the term patients loosely, might not be aware of the fact that they carry the gene because they might have good vision and they've not yet been identified. But generally speaking, right, because this is a progressive condition, a lot of the patients I see in clinic, because it's a selected group, will be registered as being legally blind or partially blind, right? The term blind, again, it has to be viewed in a kind of wider context. People are never blind. What we're talking about here is a legal definition of visual impairment in this country. But you're correct in the sense that there are people out there in the general population who carry the gene or who have visual impairment, but they've never been diagnosed. Things are getting much better now because genetic testing is available. In this country, it's free of charge to the patient. It is not the case in a lot of other countries. So there's no barrier for families going ahead with genetic testing if they decide that's the best way forward for themselves or for their children. And what we also try to do here in this country, because we have a National Health Service, is to set up a kind of national database of patients with various genetic eye conditions, including ADOA. And the reason for that is to try and follow these patients through over the years, to get a better feel of how the disease progresses, to understand how we can better monitor the condition, and eventually, when there are clinical trials out there that can be conducted, it will be easier to select patients that are eligible and therefore run the study much faster. Because that is something which I'm sure we'll talk about further down the line, but research and clinical trials are quite expensive, and the faster you can do it, the better it is.
How is the diagnosis of ADOA made? Is that specific on genomic sequencing, or can you look at other findings that point in the direction of ADOA?
Sure. Taken in a wider historical context, making a diagnosis of an inherited optic atrophy is a clinical diagnosis. I think the other thing also which is quite important is getting access to the right level of information, because it is a relatively rare condition. A lot of people out there, even general physicians, will not be aware of autosomal dominant optic atrophy. And that's where, in my experience of being involved with rare genetic eye condition, that's where patient-led organizations have an important role to play. Because unfortunately, the internet is awash of information, not all of them being accurate. So having patient-led organizations with websites and with proper information that can provide all the support needed is extremely helpful. Because in other condition where I'm involved with, which is called Labour's Hereditary Optic Neuropathy, now that we have a UK LHON society, every year we have a conference where we bring together patients, families and clinicians and researchers. It's extremely helpful because people come here, hear about the latest information, make connections with other patients and families, and it helps to build a sense of community. So I think that's the reason why it's very important to have these patient-led organizations, because it allows people to have information that they need. We know it's accurate, and also at the same time it's a way of bringing people together, because clinicians are very busy. That's the nature of the real world. Busy clinics, a lot of patients, we give as much time as we can, but when people leave your clinic, they very often have other questions. And I find that extremely helpful, and I think that's what you're trying to achieve, and that's something which I would strongly recommend.
Do you maybe know how many ophthalmologists and associated scientists are currently performing research in ADOA across the world? How much effort is currently being spent on illuminating the exact pathophysiology of ADOA and potential cures for this disease?
I think one of the things which is very clear in the field of rare diseases, collaboration will be crucial. Because if you look at the whole chain from finding a treatment to doing the clinical trials to actually getting the treatment into the clinic for the patient, it's a huge effort that probably takes 10 to 15 years. A lot of resources are needed. So you have to have a network. And I'm very fortunate that we work as part of a very nice collaborative group. I have colleagues in France, in Italy, in the Netherlands, and here also in the UK, where we do research in this area of inherited eye diseases, looking at it from different angles. Looking at it from the patient perspective, where we see patients in clinics, we get a diagnosis, and now they are part of a patient database. There's also work being done on better understanding the pathophysiology, i.e. how does a defect in a gene, for example OPA1, lead to retinal ganglion cell loss and lead to optic nerve degeneration. And this has been a real challenge, and the reason why this has been very challenging is for a very practical reason. You're not able to biopsy the optic nerve or take a chunk of the optic nerve for obvious reason, because you're going to damage the optic nerve completely. Whereas you can take a small skin biopsy, right? You can take a few strands of someone's hair, but because we are not able to get a biopsy of the retina or the optic nerve, it's been very challenging to understand what's happening at the molecular level. OPA1, to take that example because this is the most common cause of ADOA, is a very interesting protein, and without going into the complexities of it, it affects something called your mitochondria. Right? And for people who don't know much about mitochondria, it's very straightforward. These mitochondria are present in every cell in the human body, with very few exceptions. And these mitochondria are these like tiny batteries that pump energy, allows the cell to work, and allows you to see, to breathe, for your heart to beat, and all these vital functions. What is very intriguing is that OPA1 affects the mitochondria. You're not producing enough energy, but for some really enigmatic reason, the retinal ganglion cells are the ones that are most affected, and that's the reason why you get optic nerve degeneration. One of the ways of looking at this more closely is to either develop an animal model of this condition. And there are groups out there who have come up with mouse models of ADOA to try and better understand how the optic nerve works, because in that case you have more flexibility in terms of following these animals over time, and also at some point sacrificing them to look at how the optic nerve gets damaged. The other way that people have adopted, including us, is to take a small skin biopsy that has been donated to us for research purposes by patients who carry these mutations, and then these skin cells can be transformed into stem cells, known as induced pluripotential stem cells, and then it's still being optimized and refined, but then you can convert these stem cells into retinal ganglion cells, and then the aim is to use these retinal ganglion cells to understand the disease. So gene therapy is moving forward in the field of inherited eye diseases. There is already one treatment has been approved at the end of last year by the FDA for a specific cause of visual blindness, Leber's congenital amaurosis, caused by mutations in the gene RP65. So this is not science fiction, right? Gene therapy for the eye is moving forward. There will be setbacks. You will probably have to go to the drawing board, but there's no reason why gene therapy should not work in a condition like autosomal dominant optic atrophy. The key thing, of course, is to find the best way of delivering the replacement gene to make sure it's safe and effective, and also how to make sure that the right level of the gene is expressed. With regards to stem cells, there's a role for stem cells, for example, using stem cells to produce retinal ganglion cells and to study the disease and also to screen for drug molecules. The challenge in terms of replacing these retinal ganglion cells is not just replacing them at the back of the eye, but how then do you allow these retinal ganglion cells to make the right connection within the optic nerve and eventually the right connection with past the brain. So this is something which is going to be quite challenging. But having said that, right, if we look at what was there 20 years ago, who knows what will be there 20 years from now. But to me, this is further down the line. I think stem cells will be used to understand retinal ganglion cell biology. It will be very useful for drug screening, but replacing retinal ganglion cells has a lot of barriers, and frontline, to me, would be neuroprotection in its wider sense, and also potential gene therapy. As to whether or not, eventually we will have the right cocktail of molecules that allow these retinal ganglion cells to settle in the right position in the eye, to send their axons, which are the little nerve bundles, in the right direction. People are also working on this, how to signal these cells going in the right direction. Yeah. So I'm optimistic, but I think I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic about the length of time that this will require, really, right? And to me, the fastest way to find a potential drug that works in ADOA is to use a drug that is already on the market for something else and repurpose it for use in those more dominant optic atrophy. But this is a bit of luck, right? The other way is to do a more targeted approach, is you know what you're dealing with and you design your molecule to specifically target a specific part of the pathway that leads to your retinal ganglion cell being lost. So there are as many ideas as there are scientists, but I think you can probably group them into bundles and then probably rate them in terms of how quickly things can happen. But sometimes you're just lucky, right?
Yeah. Randomly
somewhere someone finds a molecule that somehow will help you. This is the history of medicine.
Yes.
A lot of drugs that we're using now were never designed specifically for that condition.
It like was penicillin. It's
like penicillin. That's a very good example.
Cambridge, right?
Exactly. That's a very good example, really, right? And these are the kind of fortuitous events in research and in medicine and in science, which basically allows a field to move quickly. So you have this background level of research happening, and then sometimes you just need a bit of luck to have a little spurt of activity, really.
Thank you very, very much that we could be here today.
Sure, and it's also been a pleasure, meeting you and getting to know about the ADOA Foundation that you want to set up, because I've also met other families from the Netherlands before, and it's great now that you're bringing people together to set up this core, and then what I'm hoping is that there will be other nucleus being set up in other countries, and you can all come together, because it is a rare disease, but compared with other ultra rare diseases, it's not that rare in that context, really.
Exactly.
And you're doing the right thing in terms of building the foundation to move things further forward. I think having this is a first step, and then the other elements will come in: raising funding, raising awareness, advocacy, and also you also have a very important role to play in terms of interaction with the scientists and with the drug industry, to tell them, well, what, you're doing research in that area, think about ADOA, get involved in this, and this could have a big impact on patients and their families.
If you'd like to get in contact, please visit www.adoa.eu. You can also subscribe to our newsletter or find more information on how to donate to Cure ADOA Foundation and help us to make research possible.